Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to validate user input from an interactive command line application. The idea is that you might ask your user for some information using a combination of print lines and the Java scanner to get some information from the user. And in the earlier videos, we just accepted that whatever the user entered was perfectly fine. But in this video, we want to take a look at what data was entered by the user and then validate it. In other words, have it pass some basic checks to see whether it is actually useful for our application. And then once we've collected all the information from the user, we're simply going to return back to the calling function a true or false as to whether or not all of the data was valid. And so to begin with, what we want to do is we want to create a little helper function then that will demonstrate the ability to validate user information interactively. So let's come on down here below our main, and let's go ahead and start by creating another public static function. Public static, and we're going to have a return value of Boolean here. So it's going to be a java.lang.boolean. And we're going to call this particular function a GetInfoWithValidation. And the idea is it's going to accept no input arguments from the command line. Everything is going to be done interactively using a java.util.scanner. And so what we want to do is real quick throw in our comment block. And then for our return value, we simply have a java.lang.boolean results variable that we are going to set optimistically equal to true, and then false if it fails validation. So what kind of information do we want to collect from the user? Well, we're going to keep this one pretty simple. We're going to collect things like the first name, last name, an email address, an age, and a height. And the reason I picked those is basically it just demonstrates a little bit of variety in the information that we're getting from the user, but also requires that we use some additional checking. For instance, in the case of the email address, we need to check for the ampersand. And so first thing that we want to do is go ahead and create some local variables that we can use to hold that information. We'll start off with our java.lang.string first name, and we're going to set it to the default value of an empty string. Java.lang.string last name, and again equal to an empty string. Java.lang.string Blazor ID or email address, again an empty string. A Java.lang.integer, and we'll have that to store our age. We're going to set the default value to 0, the initial value to 0, and then java.lang.double. And we will use that to store the height. And again, we can do some additional examples here in other videos. And so let's think about the minimum requirements for a first name. And again, we're going to keep this simple, but it must be greater than a 0 length. The idea is that you can have, for instance, a one-letter first name. Additionally, we'd probably want to check to make sure that it wasn't a numeric value or a character other than what was expected in a name. But again, we're going to save that for a later video when we start looking at regular expressions. At the very least, it needs to be length greater than 0. And so same with the last name. And then we get to the Blazor ID. And so we can start off with length greater than 0, which is true. But it also should have an ampersand in it, or possibly even check for a specific email address extension. So the @uab.edu is what we're going to use. And if you notice here, then that has a minimum character length then of 8, because the very least it has to have the @uab.edu in it, which consumes then 8 characters. For the age, we're going to assume that it is a greater than 0. And I'm going to dig into a little bit of history here. and put a value of less than 123. And where did I get that from? If you get a chance to, you can look this person up. She is the oldest known living person, as well as the height. And so we're going to assume a greater than 0. Again, you could probably make that larger than 0 for minimum height for a human. But again, we're just trying to demonstrate ranges of values here. So greater than 0 and less than 108 inches. And where did I get that from? Well, happens to be a gentleman by the name of Robert Wadlow. Robert Wadlow was the tallest human known in recent history. And so at this point, then we just need to make sure to return our results. And we need to go ahead and set up a way then to collect the information from the user. And this is going to give us an opportunity to remember how our java.util.scanner works. And we're going to create a scanner that scans then the system.in. So java.util.scanner. And again, this allows for us to type in from the command line. And little typo there on my results. So what we want to do now is we want to go through one by one, and we want to simply collect the information from the user. And your first pass at this might be what we did in the earlier videos, where we simply started off with a system.out.println. That was the message to the user. And we'll have several of these, so it probably wouldn't be a bad idea for you to just go ahead and copy and paste this. But we can provide then a nice friendly message that says, please enter a valid first name. And then we follow this up with our scanner, and we store that information then in our first name. So first name then would be equal to our scanner dot, and then what we want to do is we want to look then for the next functions, and the appropriate next function that we'd be looking for then would be the next line. And went right past it here. And so the next line scanner passed the current line and returns the input that was skipped. We could pick then a pattern, or we could just simply use the next, and that finds and returns the next complete token from this scanner. Now, before we get too much further, you can also see that we have the ability to do a next int as well as a next double. So you can guess what I'm going to be doing here. And so what we'll do is we'll start off, and you might as well take a look at the other ones as well. But we'll start off with our next. And the problem with this is that if for some reason the information that was passed by the user to our application fails at validation, they only get one shot at it. And if you need a reminder of this, go back to the earlier video with the GetInfo using strings, or GetInfo with strings, and you can see that we are collecting the information, but we're doing absolute no checking, so the user can put in something that might even be nonsense. And so to get around this, what we want to do is we want to set up a do while loop. And we'll have a do while loop for each of our variables. And we'll start off with our first name, and we want to use that minimum requirement that we had. And so do while our first name dot length is equal to 0. And while that is true, we simply move then both our printing and our scanning inside the loop. Now, keep in mind, that means this loop will run at least once, and should the user put in valid information, then they will not be reprompted. In the event that they don't put in valid information, then they will simply be prompted over and over again. And this is going to make more sense when we take a look at our other examples. Particularly, we have some additional validation with the email, age, and height. And so what you can do is we can leverage this pattern here. We'll do this one more time, then we'll start copying and pasting. We'll have another do while loop set up. And in this case, what we want to do is we again want to look at the length of the last name. And if it is equal to 0, then we simply want to repeatedly prompt the user with a friendly message that says, please enter a valid last name, followed by the assignment of the value using the scanner.next. Now, let's take a look at how we can add a little bit of sophistication to this. And particularly what we're going to be looking at now is going to be the do while associated with the Blazor ID. And this one gets a little more complicated because it needs to check multiple things. Particularly, we want it to continue to loop while our Blazor ID.length is, well, not just when it's equal to 0, because we said that that could be a minimum requirement, but we want to also include the @uab.edu. And in order for that to happen, then we would assume then that we would have a minimum email address of 9 characters or longer. So in other words, we want this loop to continue to run while the length is less than or equal to 8. Or, well, if it's less than or equal to 8, the second criterion then that we want to check is if the Blazor ID contains a specific sequence of characters. And we said that we wanted it to have our @uab.edu. And if you pull up the help for the contains, you'll notice that it returns true or false. And in this case, we sort of want to use a little bit of negative logic here, checking to see if it returns false for containing the @uab.edu. Now, before we go any further, let's see if we can figure out where my typo is here. I've got either some mismatch parentheses. Not really sure here immediately. Not a statement. There we go. I accidentally typed a parentheses instead of a curly brace here. There we go. And so let's think about this for just a second. We want to check, or we want this loop rather to run while the length is less than or equal to 8, which means that it's not long enough or that it does not contain this particular string, the @uab.edu. And again, inside of here, then what we'll do is we'll have our system.out.println and just a friendly message that says, please enter a valid email address. And again, we'll do some more sophisticated checking when we look at regular expressions. But for now, if our Blazor ID then is going to be equal to whatever is passed by the user, collected via the scanner, and assigned then to the Blazor ID. And this loop will run at least once. And if the user puts in something they aren't supposed to, then it can, in fact, run multiple times. Well, at this point, you should be starting to see the pattern. What we want to do now is we want to do the ones for the age and for the height. And again, what we'll do is we'll have the nice friendly message that says, please provide a valid age. And you can even go so far as put in values for it. So how about if we go ahead and give the user some instructions here, or some advice. So 0 less than age, less than 123. And then what we'll do now is we'll have age equal to, and then the scanner dot next int. And I appear to have went right past it. There we go. And then for the while, or for the check here, what we'll do is we'll leverage the default value that we assigned for 0, or what we can do is we can check to see a couple of things here. So we want this while loop to run while our age is less than or equal to 0, or age greater than or equal to 123. And hopefully at this point, you're starting to see this negative logic approach. In other words, if it falls outside of those boundaries, in other words, if either of those conditions return true, then the whole expression is true, and the while loop will simply run again. We're going to do the same pattern now for the height. And we'll go ahead and put in the condition. Now that you've seen it, we'll check that our height is not less than or equal to 0 by, in fact, checking to see that it is. And we want the other end of the range to be checked greater than or equal to 108. And I guess in this particular example, we'll leave it with greater than, because technically, if you depending on how you rounded, then technically you could argue that he was right under 9 feet tall, which would be 108 inches. And then what we'll do here is, again, the system.out.println, and please provide a valid height. And again, what we can do here is we can give some help to the user in the form of a prompt. And in this case, just for a little bit of variety, we'll throw in the less than or equal to 108. And then, like the earlier one, we use the scanner, but this time we'll use the next double. All right, now at this point then, if we've survived all of our loops, in other words, if we've managed to make it all the way down here to the bottom, we should then have validated all of the information from the user, in which case we'll return our results equal to true. Now let's go ahead and build this to make sure that we don't have any problems. And then let's come up here to our main and let's figure out how we can actually call this particular example. Now I'm going to have this example up relatively high so that we can then focus on moving it later on. But we simply have a else if, and if our args.length is equal to 1, and more importantly, if that 0th argument equals ignore case matches, then we'll simply use the name of our function here, GetInfoWithValidation. And if that's equal to true, then we know that we want to call our interactive GetInfoWithValidation. And what we'll do is we'll leverage a return variable, java.lang.boolean, and we're going to call it return as Boolean, just in case that we might need another return value in a later example. And what we can do now is we can simply say return as Boolean is equal to GetInfoWithValidation. And then we'll just use our system.out.println to demonstrate our results. And what we'll do is we'll simply just concatenate on then whatever the value is for our return as Boolean. Now we seem to have a typo here. Let's see if we can find it. I think I've got one too few parentheses, or arguably one too many. So this is matched up, and there we go. All right, at this point then we should be ready to test our code. Let's go ahead and build it. We can come out to our command line. You'll notice I'm already in my classes folder. There is my EE333 subfolder. And so what I want to do is I want to run our Java runtime on our EE333 fundamentals demo, and right off the bat you'll get the help if you don't pass any arguments, which reminds us that we should probably add some more to our help. And we'll pass our GetInfoWithValidation switch, in which case now we are being prompted interactively to please enter a valid first name. And if you see, if I hit enter, it's not going to do anything because there's no token on the line, and that's one of the advantages with the .next. The unfortunate advantage with the .next is that it will allow for us to put in any value. In other words, I could technically put in numeric values, and we're doing no additional validation there. It's just simply going to read it in as a string. We'll focus on breaking it later, but I'll put in my first name, I'll put in my last name, and now we can get to something that we do, in fact, have to validate. And so again, if we hit enter, because we're using .next, it's just going to ignore that, or rather it's going to keep attempting to read the next token, in which case I'm going to put in something that is invalid for an email address. And sure enough, it prompts us to please enter a valid email address. And so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and put in a valid one. So gmyers@uab.edu. That's also the way that you can reach me. And you can see that we've passed then out of that do while loop. We've been successful in our validation. Likewise, we can enter in a valid age. We'll start by putting in a valid age, and sure enough, we've passed that one. And then also a valid height. And you can see now our results are true. In other words, we've went back to the calling function, in this case main, and we had a true result from our little helper function. So now let's see if we can't break this, and let's see how badly we can break it. We'll start off by proving what I was showing earlier, or talking about earlier, and that it will accept anything, right? Valid first name could be 123. Valid last name could be 456. The email address, though, let's go ahead and try to break it in a different way. So I'm going to put in uav.edu. And sure enough, because it fails at the contains portion of our checking, in other words, it does not contain @uab.edu, then it simply prompts us again, and it will continue to prompt us until we put in a valid email address. In this case, I'm going to intentionally mistype it again. Sure enough, it does trigger another prompt. And then finally, when I type it in the correct way the third time, then it's please enter in valid age. Let's see if we can break this one. And so I'll put in a negative number, and of course that's too small and too large. Both cases will prompt us again. And then finally go ahead and put in a valid age. And then the same thing with the height. I'll put in -1.0, followed by 200. In both cases, we get prompted again to provide a valid height. And so finally, I'll put in a height that I know it will accept. Now, we'll handle this in another video, but I think you can see there's one problem with this particular approach. We'll rerun it again to highlight this. I'll put in essentially some values that would fail at the validation, which we, again, we'll speak about later with regular expressions. And I'll go ahead and put my valid email address in. But let's say, for instance, that I don't want to put my age in. And so I can put in values, and you can throw an exception because it's going to attempt to parse that age. And in this case, I passed a string, which it's not going to be happy with. So we can handle that using exceptions. We can go back and tweak that. But the other thing then that it will also not let us do is it will not let us successfully skip one of our prompts in a, how should we say this, in a more graceful way. In other words, if I don't want to enter in a valid age, maybe I just don't want to give my age, or perhaps this is some sort of user input where you're collecting information that the age is not necessarily relevant for everyone. You should have a way then perhaps to bypass this particular one. And the way to do that should not, in fact, crash the application. And so what we should have is a safe value for each one of these fields. Now, I'll handle that in a later video. I just want you to be aware of a couple of the problems here. We're going to come back and we're going to improve on this. But to keep this one short, I want to just focus on the ability to validate the user input. And so you can see here, this is how you can do this in an interactive way. Fundamentally, you use do while loops, where you use the while condition to control whether you move forward to the next prompt or not. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And thank you for watching.